Trooper Proctor took the stand. He's been with the DA's office and in the homicide unit with the state police. He said in September, he'll have been with the homicide unit for 5 years. So at the time that he investigated John O'Keefe's death, he was a rookie as far as homicide goes. Lally goes through his training. And I want to note that when you see a lawyer go through somebody's training, it can be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it proves to the court that the person is qualified for what they're doing. The flip side of that is if they're qualified, if they've had training, it means they're responsible for their action. So if you mess up, but you have training, it shows that you know better. Lally asked him about how being on call works. He said that on January 29th, he received a call from Buchanan at approximately 6:48 a.m. And that's consistent with what Buchanan said about having received a call at 6:44 a.m., letting the state police know that they have something. And Proctor said he contacted Lank. Well, when was that? Lank would have been at the crime scene at this time, and my notes show me that about 6:35, Lank received a phone call while he was on scene. And I have a note in my notes that says double check the time, so it could be off by a few minutes. So 6:48, he's contacting Lank, but he's not calling Canton PD. So how does he know to call Lank? Why isn't he just phoning Canton PD? And how does he get Lank's cell phone number? Maybe it'll be answered through the testimony. Okay. Proctor said that Lank couldn't give him much information. Well, by this time, John O'Keefe had already been sent to hospital. Lank had already spoken with Carrie Roberts. So did Lank tell Proctor that the victim was a police officer, or that the residence where the victim was found belonged to another police officer? Because by this time, we know that Lank knew who lived in that house. Because according to Lank's own testimony, he sent Jen McCabe into the house. And we see from Good's dash cam video that Jen McCabe entered the Fairview home at 6:34 a.m. So all of these communications and events are happening very close together, and that's the way it goes. So it's important to get things down to the minute as much as possible. And in this trial, it has been difficult because not everybody's telling the truth, and you can't even rely on official records. For whatever reason, Lank couldn't give Proctor much information. I find that interesting. Lally just led the crap out of him. He pretty much testified for Proctor. The way he phrased this question, which is actually more like a statement, he gets away with leading so much. So Proctor's testimony is that he contacted Lank, and then he knew he needed to contact a paramedic at the hospital who was treating Mr. O'Keefe. Do you recall the EMTs at the hospital saying that they spoke with troopers in the morning? I don't recall that, but that was a long time ago. It seems like years ago now, the beginning of this trial. Does anyone remember that? And I have a question here. Buchanan gets a call at 6:44 a.m. Proctor gets a call at about 6:48 a.m. They contact Lank, and clearly, according to Proctor's testimony, he is engaged in some sort of fact-finding. So the state police are involved. They haven't said, like we understood at the beginning, or at least I thought in the beginning, the way it was presented. The state police haven't said, no, we're not touching it, we're not doing it, call us after he's pronounced. We're not hearing anything like that. No, they're engaging now at 6:48 in the morning and taking further steps. I mean, going as far as reaching out to paramedics, tracking them down and reaching out to them at the hospital hospital, according to Proctor. So why on God's green earth did they not call crime scene services? If they're involved, then why aren't they calling in crime scene services at 6:48? Why is Proctor not telling Canton Police, hey, preserve that scene until we get there? Do your best. Don't touch anything, cordon it off, start logging who's there, who approaches the scene, who leaves, etc., etc. There's a whole list of things that the first responding officers on the scene like that are supposed to do, and it's taught to every police officer, or it ought to be. And this guy just finished saying he's trained and he's a homicide detective. How do you not take that initial basic step of preserving evidence? The first thing you want to do. You can figure it all out later, but once it's messed up, it's messed up. They know that. Why at 6:48 a.m. is he not making sure that that scene is secure, that evidence is preserved? And how does he know, by the way, at this point, that paramedics are still with O'Keefe at the hospital and that he hasn't been admitted yet? Not clear on how he might know that, unless he's assuming something, unless he's omitting information. So, okay, I guess we're going to hear that he contacted the supervisors of the EMTs to figure out who was at the hospital. Lally asks, how did you know to contact Lang? How did you get his contact information? And the answer was, I knew he was on scene, so I called him. Well, how did you know he was on scene? And how did you get his contact information? Who told you that, bud? Who gave you the information? And he's sitting there, mouth grooming like crazy. He's nervous on the stand. We're never clear, really, on how he got Lank's contact information, because leading Lally pretty much testified for him and said, well, you were informed by Canton Police, right? And that's how you knew he was on scene and all that. And we never learned how he got the contact number for Lank's cell phone, or why Canton Police wouldn't just fill him in. Why does he need to call Lank on the scene? He's busy. Unless, of course, he's calling Lank to say, hey, secure the scene. But obviously that's not what happened. Okay. So now we move on. And he's saying he reached out to firefighter Flamati. Oh, yeah? So how does he do that? Did he call Flamati's station and say, hey, who took our guy to the hospital? Did he call the hospital and say, hey, are there paramedics there with this casualty? Because we need to do an investigation here. How does he get this information? And how does he reach out? But okay, we're just going to gloss over this story and not ask for any details. And I wouldn't worry about it. Most of the time, if an officer's saying, yeah, I reached out to so-and-so, I wouldn't question it. But because there is so much in this case that is questionable, and because Lally is leading, which makes me wonder why you need to do that, bud. And because so much has been distorted and redirected that you can't trust anything. You have to ask questions about everything. And it's too bad. And according to Proctor, who makes his statement and then closes his eyes, Flamati told him about O'Keefe's arm injuries, the injuries to his face, and said that O'Keefe only had a 10% chance of living. Are there any EMTs listening? Would you say that to a detective? Would you give a percentage on a patient like that? And if Flamati is busy with John O'Keefe because they're in the hospital and they're doing CPR, they're doing active CPR until a team can take over, how's Flamati talking on the phone or whatever he's doing, texting? How is this happening? Okay. And Proctor's response after speaking with Flamati and hearing about John's injuries, Proctor called Buchanan and informed Buchanan that this is more of a medical issue. Are you freaking kidding me? If he'd heard about a heart attack, a drug overdose, any number of other things, it looks like a medical issue. He's got trauma wounds on him. So, yes, that's a medical issue. but he's got trauma wounds on him. And according to Proctor's own testimony, Flammati told him only a 10% chance of living. And he calls Buchanan back and says, yeah, it seems like more of a medical issue. What? You know what this sounds like? You know, those guys who don't want to do their jobs? You know what? I'll just, it's just this. I'm going to minimize it or brush it off or relabel it because, you know, my shift ends in a few minutes and maybe the next shift will get it. Maybe it really isn't that important. You know, in Ontario here, we had paramedics charged criminally and convicted because they fluffed off a patient like that and didn't take him seriously. This guy died because they fluffed him off. And you see this stuff happen all the time. And it's in every profession, I would imagine. You always get that guy or that woman who just doesn't really want to do their job. They want to kind of skate by as much as possible. And that's what this sounds like. You could interpret it as something worse than a guy who's just lazy and doesn't want to do his job. So after he says, it seems more like a medical issue, they're still going to go. They're still going to go out. And he gives this explanation, a narrative. And you know how I would be if it was a suspect doing this. He volunteers this narrative for questions that weren't even asked to explain they got authorization to use their personal vehicles. Because I guess the state police are so terribly underfunded that they can't afford vehicles that are capable of driving in the snow in a state where it snows. Is anybody else thinking that is incredible? So they take their own vehicles to Canton PD, their own vehicles that don't have recording devices in them, where they're not going to be tracked. And look at this guy. Every time he's done answering a question, he closes his eyes. They arrive at the Canton Police Station at 10 a.m. Wait a minute. He got the call at 6:48. The reason that he got the call, according to his testimony and Buchanan's testimony, is that Trooper Proctor was on call. And when you're on call, it means you're ready to go. Everybody out there who has been on call, who works in any kind of emergency service or first response, you're ready to go. You know this. Your driveway's plowed. So he was on call and he wasn't ready to go. Okay. He sounded like a guy who just does not want to work. But boy, I have a feeling he's going to work today. They get to Canton Police Department at 10 a.m. Between 6:48 and 10 a.m., who called Crime Scene Services? Who called Canton Police and said, hey guys, make sure nothing at that crime scene gets touched. Hey guys, can you put up the barrier tape for us and just hold it down till we get there? It's storming real bad. It might take us a bit. Can you just hang on to it for us? Who did that? So we have two troopers who are aware and they know they need to respond. And both of them are in positions where they know that this needs to be done. Buchanan's a supervisor. Proctor is a trained homicide detective. Look, a rookie knows you got to secure a scene. So why didn't they make any calls for that? Why wasn't that done? That has never been adequately explained. Oh, Lally asked an interesting question. He said, where were you at 8:22 in the morning? Proctor very quickly said home. And leading Lally testifies for Proctor pretty much that, oh, you needed to shovel out, right? You weren't shoveled out. So, why doesn't Lally just take the stand and give the testimony? Because he's doing it anyway. He's testifying anyway. So, of course, that's got my brain thinking, oh, what's the significance of 8:22 a.m.? I guess we're going to find out. Lally asked, where did you go when you arrived at Canton Police Department? And the answer was, we spoke with Sergeant Good. It's not quite where did you go. And wow, did he ever gloss over this information that he supposedly got? He said, Jen McCabe said she was at the waterfall the night before with some people, and she was the one who called 911. So he just skipped over, well, pretty much everything. It's like they're purposely disconnecting dots instead of connecting them. So you're a detective and you hear, oh, this witness was at the waterfall the night before. Well, what are you thinking? You're thinking, all right, so what? Tell me more. Why is this relevant? Was she at the waterfall with the victim? Was she at the waterfall with a suspect? Why is this important? And it was important enough for another officer to tell Proctor. So he's not asking questions, or is he just not spilling information here? It's all very vague. And where the heck are his notes? Lally asks, have you ever met or aware of Jennifer McCabe, Carrie Roberts, John O'Keefe, or Karen Reed? And he says, I've never met any of them. Proctor said that after they spoke with Sergeant Good, they didn't speak with anyone else at the Canton Police Station. So watch out for two things. Watch to hear if he slips up and says he got information from somebody else at Canton Police Station. And I think the other part of the reason that Lally asked this is because he's trying to get across that Proctor did not talk to Brian Higgins at the Canton Police Station. I think that's why he's asking this question. He testifies that after being at Canton PD, they go to the home of Matt and Jen McCabe, which I still find very weird. What information did he receive from Good that caused them to go to a peripheral place? What information compelled them to go there as opposed to going to the scene, especially considering that their victim had traumatic injuries? And whether you want to argue those injuries are from a vehicle or something else, whatever the mechanism of injury was, it's at Fairview. Or it was at Fairview. So why are they not going there? And the other consideration is, where's my scene? So part of the scene is the victim's body. I know that sounds horrible, but it's a fact. That's part of your scene. Part of the scene is Fairview outside and that area where he was found. Part of your scene may be other places in the vicinity of where he was found. Because at this point, they don't know anything. They don't know if he was chased by a tiger down the road for 3 blocks. I mean, nobody checked, right? Nobody asked the questions about how he got to be where he was. They hadn't asked those questions, and that's weird. And so the other obvious potential scene is inside the house where he was found, especially considering that there's a connection between O'Keefe and the people in the house. And you don't just go up to a potential suspect and say, hi, did you commit this murder or bank robbery? And have them say, no, I wouldn't do that. Never did it. You think the officer's going to go like, okay, that's fine then. Like, what world is this? So while they're doing other stuff, the crime scene is still not being secured, and potential suspects have control over evidence or potential evidence, including inside the house. And if the Alberts are sadly caught up in all of this, and it's just a horrible tragedy for them that they got entangled in this. You know what would have prevented all the questions and the speculation? You know what would have prevented that? To have the police actually treat the place like it's a crime scene. To have the police actually investigate. And yeah, I heard before them say on the stand, oh, we don't have probable cause. Baloney. And you know what? The Alberts could have consented to a search, and then you don't need a search warrant. Did they offer that? And at each stage of this, I want to know, why is that scene still not being protected? Why is the scene left in the hands of potential perpetrators? Because at this point in the investigation, they don't know. They don't know what happened. And they're not actually following the evidence. It's a little bit inside out. And that makes you wonder why as well. Lally asks him how long he was with Buchanan. So between 10 a.m. and 5:30 in the afternoon, that was his first answer. Then he added to it and he said, we also had a debrief meeting with just the troopers in my office at Canton PD. All right. So that was his second answer that he sort of added to his first answer on his own. And no one asked him about what he was doing. The question was, how long were you with Buchanan? So he gives the approximate times, and then this extra piece comes after a pause. First of all, it's an explanation. So this little bit is a narrative of Proctor's. This narrative is important to him to get out there. And there was a meeting at Canton PD, a debrief meeting. Why? Why are they having a debrief meeting there? And he said, with just the troopers, plural, in my office. Well, he has to make it clear that it's just the troopers in his office, which makes me think that no, it wasn't, that there was something else going on. So there's something right there. Sometime that evening, there was something going on right there. And when he says troopers in my office, plural, well, who is that? We already know he and Buchanan are together. So were there other troopers there at Canton PD that he met with for debriefing? What the heck is this about? There's something here. What is he hiding right here? Oh man, I wish I could ask some questions. And so he amends his answer. So now it's from 10 to 6, 7, because we also went back to the office with some evidence. So now he's talking about leaving Canton PD and going back to his office, which is a separate location from where he was having this other debrief meeting at Canton PD with just the troopers in his office. Lally asks an interesting question, the way he put it, because, you know, he's leading. He says, so other than short drives in your individual cars, you were with Trooper Buchanan all day. So other than the times that you weren't with Trooper Buchanan, you were with him, right? Yeah. Okay. And they go from the station in the morning to speak with Jen and Matt McCabe. So he's telling us this again. And it comes out here that he also spoke with Brian Albert at the McCabes. And all of that is flippin' bizarre, has been from the get-go. This whole thing is just Twilight Zone. You know what song keeps floating around in my head? You know, remember that old song by Jefferson Airplane, Go Ask Alice? That one. So he makes it known that all the interviews that he did with another trooper. So they weren't one-on-one. And he, I think, was trying to say, and all the witnesses were interviewed separately. And then he said, with one exception, and I expected him to say Brian and Nicole Albert, because Buchanan just testified that Brian and Nicole Albert were interviewed together, or in the sense that Nicole Albert was interviewed and Brian was sitting there. But he's saying Chris and Julie. So now we have 4. Chris and Julie Albert were interviewed together. Brian and Nicole Albert were interviewed together by these troopers, by the way. And Brian Albert is at Jen McCabe's house. Of course, not eavesdropping. I mean, he would never do that, right? Probably couldn't hear a thing. Probably didn't talk to Jen at all after her interview, right? Because it's all so nice and clean. But he's not securing the crime scene or causing it to be secured. Proctor says he never met Brian Albert until that interview. He said they went to Good Samaritan Hospital, partly to look at John O'Keefe's injuries and partly because they knew that Karen Reed was there on a section. And he said when he got there that he learned that she had been released hours before. He says they got to Good Samaritan at 1 o'clock. He testified about O'Keefe's injuries. He talked about the abrasions, he called them abrasions, on John's arm. He described them as abrasions and described sort of the pattern. And then he added, and there was nothing underneath the arm. Okay, maybe he observed that. But you know what he's not saying here? If he's going to point to the absence of something, why is he not also pointing to the absence of injuries everywhere else, where injuries would be expected to be if he'd been hit by a Lexus? Mind you, at this time, when they're going to the hospital, they don't know that, because he just said earlier, oh, yeah, it seems like a medical issue, yet somehow they're out there because it's a medical issue. But whatever, I've given up on expecting anybody to actually make sense. The reason his noting the absence of injuries on the other side of John's arm is interesting to me is that it makes me think that he has been following in the media and on social media the debate about dog bites. There are people who believe that dog bites would leave marks on both sides of the arm, and that's not true. And dog bites can look like a lot of other kinds of injuries, and dog bites are very often overlooked. And in one of my previous videos, I cited a study and a dog bite expert and a case in which a woman was convicted of murder when she hadn't done it. And what had really happened was that her child had been attacked and mauled by a dog, but she was accused of stabbing the child. And it wasn't until years later that they were able to actually prove that. And she was finally exonerated after losing her children and spending years in prison. But I'm going off topic, sort of. There are a lot of people who have this idea in their heads that a dog bite would be like a human bite, where you would see both the upper and lower jaws. But most of the time, that is not the case. So I think that he's followed the stories and he's throwing this in there. He testified that he was able to see there was blood around the back of the head, but he was not able to see if there was any significant trauma to the back of the head. And this is interesting because he's there with Buchanan, and Buchanan testified that one of the reasons he made remarks to the ME was because injuries from a drinking glass wouldn't cause the significant injury on the back of O'Keefe's head that he observed while he was at the hospital with Proctor. So you're telling me that these two troopers are in there and they're observing and they're not talking to each other? That one of them notices something significant and doesn't bother to tell the other? Come on. He testifies that they noticed John O'Keefe's clothing in the corner. And I am actually going to cut him a little bit of slack here, because in the corner or at the foot of the bed is an easy mistake to make. He said the thing that jumped out to him was that there was only one sneaker. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because wouldn't all the blood jump out at you? But okay, so he notices there's a sneaker missing. He said while he's been with the unit, he's only investigated 3 or 4 incidents where a pedestrian was struck by a motor vehicle. That's surprisingly low of a number. He said that he did see other things while he was working on the road. And then he testifies that all the time he was on the road, he only investigated maybe 3 or 4. So not many. And I mean, everybody's got to start somewhere, right? But the other thing he said was he only spent 6 years on the road. So, like, he's a double rookie. How do you spend only 6 years on the road and you get moved from the road to homicide? How does that happen? Like, that seems to me like a fast track. Maybe it's different there. Lally was able to elicit that this trooper's experience in dealing with car accidents, one of the things that he knew was that often the footwear of the victim would be knocked off. And that's true. He also said that often the footwear remains at the point of impact. So certainly that's a clue And as every investigator knows, even when you have a clue, it's important not to get locked into a direction, especially early on in an investigation. Proctor said that he and Buchanan notified Tully about the missing shoe. Lally asks him about the search, and the way Lally phrases it is that a search took place in the afternoon. And I'll just remind you that the search didn't start until around 6 o'clock. I don't know what qualifies as afternoon or evening. He testified that he was informed that Tully found the shoe at the scene that was a match to the shoe at the hospital. Really, he should be saying consistent with, same description, appeared to be the other shoe. So we know it wasn't Sir who found the shoe. That's an important little detail, I think, because the way it was presented at trial made it sound like it was the CERT team who found everything. But now we're hearing it's Tully who found the shoe. Tully was one of the extra people who were at the scene. What were Tully's hours that day? Was he on duty or off duty? Proctor testified that the clothing seemed wet. He said saturated. He said the right sleeve of the shirt had tears in it. And you saw photos of that shirt. They were puncture wounds. You could call that tears. But you also saw that you need to look closely at the shirt to see those. So it appears through his testimony that he looked closely enough at that shirt to see those tears or those holes in the shirt. Now I want to know, did he find rust, dirt, oil, anything like that on that sleeve? Or were there twigs on it, anything on it that would indicate that those tears or punctures to the shirt were caused by a particular thing? He also said the clothes were covered in blood and vomit. If Officer O'Keefe was vomiting on his clothes, then the question is going to be, where was it? Was this something that happened when he was flat on the ground? EMTs said that there was a lot of blood and vomit in the back of his throat. So where it is on the clothing matters. And Lally's asking him about how he goes about securing evidence. And if this wasn't so flippin' tragic, I would laugh, because the scenes weren't secure. And we know already what has happened, or what has not happened, I should say, with the chain of custody of evidence. We know that there's an evidence envelope with Buchanan's name written on it that Buchanan never filled out, containing items that Buchanan did not find, did not put into any evidence bag. And the writing appears to be in Proctor's writing. So once again, what's being glossed over here is more important than what is being elicited. Those scenes were never secured. The scene outside of Fairview and the scene inside of Fairview remained in the control of suspects. Proctor testified that the evidence goes from wherever they collected. It goes into a bag. It's documented on the bag. It's taken to their office, to an evidence processing area in their office, and then it goes to the evidence storage elsewhere. So when they're talking about this evidence processing area in their office, what exactly is this place? Does anybody know? Where I am, Inside Forensics has controlled entry. You have to swipe in and out. And even within that area, there are other areas that are also secure. There are procedures for keeping things clean, for preventing cross-contamination, and there are different ways that different items have to be stored. And nobody is allowed to touch or handle any evidence there unless they're trained specifically in that. So I want to know about this evidence processing area within an office. Proctor did testify that in order to get in and out of where this evidence is kept within the office is entry control, and very few people have access to this, but he's one of the people who do have access. But then he says he doesn't have access to the evidence storage. So it sounds like the evidence processing is in one area, evidence storage is a separate area, but it still doesn't sound like it's crime scene services or CSIs. What kind of training do the troopers get in processing evidence? Why is it that there are homicide detectives handling evidence and laying it out to dry and that sort of thing? I mean, this is state police. I could understand this maybe if this was a tiny little town police service who maybe doesn't have the funding or access, but this is the state police. I'm sorry, maybe you guys know the answers. It just seems weird to me. He said he received O'Keefe's phone from the Canton Police Department, and Lally asked him, was that before or after he went to the hospital? And he said, after, I believe. Well, if he's collected the evidence properly, there will be an evidence bag. And if he's done it properly, there will be somewhere a notation in a report that shows what time exactly he retrieved the evidence. So he could answer the question. They could provide that information if they wanted to. And so this has got me questioning why they're not. And we know he went from Canton Police to Jen McCabe's, to the hospital, to Dighton, then back to Canton Police. It sounds like they knew already that they would be seizing Reed's vehicle. So I'm interested in learning how they were confident enough before they even went to Dighton that it was Reed's vehicle involved in this incident and not any other vehicle. There were a number of people who were at that residence, and anybody could have driven by if it was a motor vehicle collision. And if that's what they're saying happened, did they examine any other vehicle? What made them, without having seen Reed's vehicle, what made them go there that early? Had Jen McCabe, in her original statement, I want to see those statements, had Jen McCabe said anything at the very beginning to the first responding officers about a cracked taillight? So the question about the phone becomes, where at Canton Police Department was the phone? Where did they keep it? So we have still not seeing a full chain of custody for pretty much anything. Maybe we'll hear about it later. Proctor says that they called Dighton Police, and that's a courtesy, and we know that, and that's pretty standard. And he said he wanted to arrange a tow truck. I don't know why he couldn't just do that, but okay. And he says in his testimony that they also wanted to arrange a plow truck. Well, how on earth does he know before he even gets there that they're going to need a plow truck for the Reed's driveway? How does he know whether or not the Reed family has a snowblower or has already had that driveway plowed? And when you listen to Barrow's testimony, the Dighton officer who did go, he said he noticed how much snow there was, and he thought maybe he could get that plowed. It would be easier for the tow driver, and he took the initiative and got that plowed. He was never asked. His testimony wasn't that he was asked. He did testify that Proctor asked him to arrange a tow, which he did. But he was never asked to arrange a plow. So Proctor here on the stand is throwing in extras, information that can't be true, and that he couldn't have known he would need a plow. So this is a narrative. This isn't testimony. This is a story. Then he testifies that they requested a plow for him and Buchanan to get down the roadway as well as plow the driveway. Where is this coming from? Buchanan didn't testify to that. In fact, he testified that they waited quite some time when they got there. And they had to walk through snow that was at least waist deep at times. And he never testified to not being able to get down the road and having to call ahead for a plow. And the Dighton police officer never testified to anything about having the road plowed in front of them. This guy's just making up crap. He testified that the weather conditions were really bad, high winds, whiteout conditions. They had to drive really slow to get there. How does a chunk of glass and a little hair precariously perched on a vertical surface of the SUV managed to hang on in those conditions, even if it was just sitting there? High winds. He testified that Dighton police arrived first before he and Buchanan approached the Reed home. This seems to be important. So I'm just making note of this testimony because it might or might not come up later. We learn through a document that Lely has that the SUV was indeed Reed's vehicle and all of that. They have to go through that. But the other little tidbit that we learn here is that Reed had that SUV for a year at that point. And that's important because if there are small scratches on the vehicle, it's been driven around for at least a year. So it's hard to say where those scratches came from. Now, also, there was damage to the back of that vehicle. And there was no evidence that anyone checked for paint transfer on her vehicle. He said that he viewed the taillight and the right rear taillight had large pieces missing from it. This is different from Barrow's testimony. He said the taillight was cracked, which is what the accused said herself, that it was cracked. And he said there was a piece missing. And we know from what we saw from the lab that there was a piece missing from that taillight, a clear piece that was never recovered. So the information about that one clear piece that was never ever recovered from the lab, and information from Barrows saying cracked and a piece missing, and what Reed says herself, or what she apparently said, that her light was cracked, those things are all consistent. And those are different from this other narrative we're hearing about large pieces missing or a large piece missing, and large enough to be really obvious. All that red had disappeared, according to the other narrative. The police officers who attended John's home to do a welfare check on the kids didn't notice anything wrong with the taillight, but they said they weren't really looking at the taillight. It was caked in snow, and they said they couldn't tell even from their dash cameras, and they were there. And Barrows has no reason to lie. He said they told Reed they would be seizing her phone and they would be running a search warrant for that. He said that they asked for contact information for the Cameranos, and Reed retrieved that from her phone. And both he and Buchanan specifically added into their testimony that she used a passcode to open her phone. And I don't think that this is an accident that they're saying she needed to use a passcode. So I'm just going to mentally make note of that and see if anything comes of that. Proctor says that when they seize a phone, the standard thing that they do is they hand that phone over to a different officer in his office who will try to access the data on the phone after they have a warrant. And I have a question. It might not matter, but you know me and details. I have a question about this. When he says try to access the data, does he mean just looking through the phone and accessing the information from the phone that way? Or does he mean access data as in Celebrate? So I'm not clear on that. He also says that they put the phone into airplane mode. He says they left Dighton at 4:16 p.m. and arrived in the Sally Port at approximately 5:31 p.m. I mean, obviously he's reviewed these times before testifying. He's probably reviewed footage. Lally asks him, why was it taken to Canton Police? Why was that decision made? And Proctor says, well, he wasn't really part of that decision, but his understanding was that the Sally Port in Canton was heated and the State Police Sally Port in Milton was not heated and could not accommodate a vehicle of that size. Really? Okay. Well, I don't know anything about this other Sally Port, so I can't really comment on that. But we're talking about the State Police. They only have one facility, and that facility cannot accommodate an SUV? This just seems odd to me. I mean, unless there is some other facility, but maybe it's too far away. And why not, if they're in Dighton, why not ask Dighton Police if they could use their facilities? I mean, they've already got them to plow a road, according to Proctor, and plow a driveway and arrange a tow truck and sit outside the Reed residence while they're there. So Canton, a place that is conflicted, why there then? And you saw that Sally Port. That's not a huge place either. Interesting. In respect to the temperature inside the Canton Police Department Sally Port, the witness says he doesn't know what the temperature was, but it was certainly warmer than outside. Well, yeah, it's a blizzard and freezing cold out. I mean, a doghouse is going to be warmer than the outside. So that doesn't tell us a whole lot. What may tell us something is the fact that there was snow on the floor inside that Sally Port when we see the SUV arriving. So if it's a heated Sally Port, why is there snow unless that snow had very recently dropped off of another vehicle or had been cleared off of another vehicle? So did Canton Police have another vehicle sitting in the Sally Port that had just been brought in just shortly before the SUV and cleared off in there and then moved out close enough in time that that snow on the ground didn't have time to melt? Did that happen? Because we're not hearing about that. We're not hearing about Canton Police having a vehicle there and then needing to move it. And I know it might seem like a small detail, but these things bother me. It all has to fit together or I'm not happy. So there was a ring of snow on that floor. So if it's heated, why isn't it melted? And if it's heated, then that tells you that that snow on the floor had not been there very long. And also, the snow on that floor came from a vehicle that was about the same size as Reed's vehicle, which wouldn't be hard to do. There are lots of vehicles that size. We just never heard about anybody having to move another vehicle to accommodate Reed's vehicle. And if they knew a couple hours in advance that Reed's vehicle was going to be towed and put into this Sally Port, why didn't they move whatever vehicle that was in there and clean up the snow before the SUV ever arrived? Just questions. He said he never touched anything on that taillight and that the tow truck driver was the one to pull the vehicle into the Sally Port. And at the point that he's being asked these questions, his blink rate went way up. His rate of swallowing went way up. His respiration went way up. Now, those things only indicate a spike in stress. And he knows that these are important questions. And he's aware of the allegations and the speculation circulating around about him in relation to this very topic. So you can't say by those indicators alone that he's lying. He said there were other troopers at the scene and other troopers conducting interviews, and then they all met at the Canton Police Station. what other troopers were conducting interviews, because we've heard from all these witnesses throughout this trial, and maybe I am failing to remember who did interviews of all these people. I know for sure that Proctor and Buchanan were involved in interviews, and it seems to me there was another, maybe Tully involved in something, which I'm finding interesting now in retrospect, because I've learned that Tully is Buchanan's supervisor, and Buchanan is a supervisor. I'd have to go back and scour my notes, and I don't want to. And how come we didn't hear about troopers on scene at Fairview? Now it's the end of the night in a conference room at Canton Police Department with these troopers to have a debrief meeting. Okay, it makes sense to have a debrief meeting, but the way he's phrasing, he says the end of the night. And earlier when he referenced this meeting, he used that as a way to indicate how long he had been with Buchanan. The time he gave there was not very late. Well, CERT only started their search at 6. So had they completed that search and arrived back at Canton Police Department before 7? Because Proctor's earlier testimony was that he was with Buchanan and included this meeting, this debrief meeting. And now he's saying the end of the night. So, when the CERT search starts, it's afternoon, which is 6 o'clock. And now it's the end of the night. And Buchanan testified about getting to the office. He thought they didn't leave the office now, not Canton PD, until around 10 o'clock at night. Lally asks, as far as that debrief meeting, it was only members from your unit, your office, right? Proctor says, right. Well, CERT is not from his unit, his office. That's a completely different unit. So who were these other troopers from Proctor's office and his unit meeting there? Who were they? And Lally asked Proctor, there were no Canton police officers there, right? And Proctor says, right. And here it comes out that at this point, so this is January 29th, after they've seized Reed's vehicle, according to Proctor, Canton police had to take a step back. They weren't going to participate in any interviews or anything of that nature. Well, of that nature, not sure what that means. If Canton police were only supposed to be recused from interviews only, then there would be no reason to exclude them from a debrief meeting. So the explanation doesn't quite meet what happened. Okay, I'm going to let you hear this, and I'm going to let you hear exactly how he words it. First, he said, the reason Canton police were not in the debrief meeting is because they had to take a step back and not participate in interviews or anything of that nature. And that was 5 seconds ago that he said this. And this is the exchange that happens next.
As far as that meeting is concerned, that's just troopers from your unit, from your office. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so there were no members of the Canton Police Department that were present for that. Is that correct?
No, correct.
And do you know why that was?
They had taken a step back from the investigation. They weren't going to participate in any interviews or anything of that nature.
And how was that communicated to you and Sergeant Buchanan?
The best of my recollection was that debrief meeting that we were informed that essentially Canton PD would be taking a step back from the investigation, and that now this is just solely a Norfolk State Police investigation.
So he was informed. By whom? Who said that? And it sounds like he was informed at the meeting, not prior to the meeting. But okay, there is an officer there who is superior to him, and that's Buchanan. So it may well be that Buchanan was the one who had discussions with somebody about Canton Police taking a step back. This is January 29th that he's talking about here. And he just said that this is solely a state police investigation now. And I think that's an important point because that means that state police have responsibility. I mean, they had responsibility over the scene and everything else when they got the call at 6:44 a.m. But this is solely a state police investigation. So Canton PD should have nothing to do with it at this point. Yet they're leaving their key piece of evidence, if we go by their interpretation of everything, in the custody of a place that is conflicted, and they know that. So they knew this before they walked out the doors that night. That's a problem. Even if you accept everything that Proctor has said, if you accept everything as fact, then it's still a problem. And you know what else is still a problem? None of the scenes were secured. And by this point, on January 29th, as they're leaving, that scene outside and inside Fairview has not been secured ever. It was never secured. And by this time, they know that the victim was a police officer. Through questioning, it's established that Proctor was the case officer on this particular incident. And Lally wants him to explain what that means. What's a case officer? And Proctor starts out by saying, well, you delegate tasks. And then he explains how it's a collaborative effort and that pretty much everybody drops what they're doing and everybody gets involved. So that was the first part of what he said. And there's going to be a second part, and I'm going to get to that. And I think his point here is, hey, if something went wrong, it's not just me. That's the cynical part of me. So it's this collaborative effort. But when you look at all the evidence collection, all the things that were done, it's Proctor. Then the second part of what he's saying in terms of what a case officer does, he says the case officer essentially keeps the records, collects the evidence. Well, we have something here where when you've got a team assigned to a case, one member of the team is assigned to basically maintaining the file and making sure all the paper is in order and everything is documented and organized and all your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed. Because on a big file, things can get disorganized or mixed up or confused or missed if somebody isn't on top of that, and it's going to go to court and there will be questions asked about everything. So you know you got to do that. When I'm listening to this and I can only look through my own lens, my own experience, I'm listening to this and that's what it makes me think of. But then it makes me think, well, okay, why was this not done then? Because it's a mess. He also reiterates that, hey, he has supervisors. He's not the only one making decisions. And it's a group effort. So this sort of diffuses responsibility. I think this is what the point is. Perhaps the point of the question is about diffusion of responsibility. I don't know that for a fact, but that's what it looks like. Lally asks what was discussed during this debriefing meeting. He says the pieces found at Fairview Road, the shoe that was found, and interviews conducted. And remembering back through the testimony of this trial, there weren't a lot of interviews conducted. They spoke with Reed on the 29th. They interviewed the McCabe's and Brian Albert at the McCabe's, which is still bizarre. They say they spoke with Flamati, and I don't recall hearing about a report from the 29th. Other witnesses weren't interviewed until much later. So all these witnesses that these other troopers conducted interviews, where are they? And I suppose technically Matt McCabe, Jen McCabe, and Brian Albert, that is considered interviews, plural, but it wasn't other troopers who conducted that. And Canton Police did speak to people at the scene, but according to Proctor here, nobody from Canton Police was in this debrief. So It couldn't have been those interviews. And I'm kind of wondering, when they were at the hospital, did they not speak to medical staff there? Because by the time they got to the hospital, the EMTs are long gone, right? Did they speak to the ER doctor, the nurses? I mean, we haven't heard that. He says this debrief meeting took about a half an hour or an hour. So if we're talking timelines here, they get back, according to him, they get back to Canton PD at about 5:30, and they're in the Sallyport, and CERT must be finished with their search at Fairview, because in debriefing, they're discussing what was found. CERT didn't start searching till about 6 o'clock. They got there earlier than that, but they didn't actually start the search until 6. But earlier, Proctor had said he was with Buchanan. This debrief takes a half an hour. Wow, these timelines are tight. And Buchanan said they didn't leave the office. So after they left Canton PD, they went back to their office, and Buchanan thought that it was maybe around 10 o'clock. So I'm just sort of making note in my head here of the timeline. It just seems really tight. And I wish this trooper had notes or reports, because everything you do as a police officer is supposed to get written down, including things like, at such and such a time, I received a call from this person about this thing. It would be really helpful if somebody would show their flippin' notes. So by the time he's leaving Canton Police Department, he's saying he already has all the evidence that was collected. Reed's cell phone, John's cell phone, the shoe, the red pieces of plastic, the clothing from the hospital. And they have the vehicle is going to stay in Canton. So where was John's phone before he got it? We know that John's clothing went along for the ride, driving all the way to Dighton and back, in the back of Buchanan's personal vehicle. And we don't know the chain of custody of the shoe and the taillight pieces. And we have now learned that it wasn't CERT who found the shoe. As for those plastic pieces, we still don't know who exactly found them, because it appears that that wasn't properly documented. And I think I need to point out that I'm making an assumption here. And that assumption is that each of these items are in their own evidence bags, all separate. And I'm recognizing I am making this assumption because that's how it's supposed to be done. But given how everything was handled in this case, I don't think it's safe for me to make that assumption that these things were all placed in separate bags and properly labeled and properly logged and all of that. I just feel like I need to let you know that. And the other thing that is missing here is the blood. They collected blood in red Solo cups, and Proctor has not once mentioned the blood at all. And when he listed the things that they took back to their office, their evidence area in their office, there was no mention of the blood. And we've seen photos of the blood in the Solo cups in the Stop and Shop bag. When you look at those photos, you can see that the liquid in those cups is liquid. It's not frozen. I have questions as to how exactly that was stored. The woman from the lab said when she took the swab from the Solo cup, and that was February 1st, she had to thaw out the blood because it was frozen. So where was it so that it would be frozen? And where was it to thaw it out? And how long did that take? Just asking questions here. But I do note that Proctor has failed to mention the blood drops at all and what happened with those. And knowing that Canton police had been recused at this point, it would be really important to not let them be in custody of any evidence at all, especially blood evidence that could show maybe more than one contributor. And it's also evidence that is not properly stored. Solo cups are not proper storage. So why didn't they do anything about that? Why are they leaving that with Canton Police? Also, the person from the lab who did that swab just took a swab from one solo cup, not all of them, and she left the rest of the blood with the Canton Police. So, if that blood shows up anywhere else, this is a mess. It's a mess. So we have a little bit of a chain of custody here. 2 cell phones were given to another trooper. The items of clothing, the way he said they were laid out on butcher paper in our evidence intake area. Okay. Were laid out by who laid them out? Who did that? Who laid them out? Who was there? Was it a person who was trained in forensics? And evidence intake area. In my brain, an evidence intake area is very different from an evidence processing area. So I have questions about this. I'm not saying that it's wrong because I don't have enough information, but intake and processing are different things. As I hear more, instead of having questions answered, I just end up with more questions. The bagged taillight pieces were set aside in the evidence intake area. He says that he and Buchanan didn't have access to the evidence locker. Those pieces of purported taillight that were found on the 29th, that evidence envelope just, evaporated. When the person who reassembled that taillight and then put it over top of the housing, when she testified, they showed all of the different envelopes that contained all the pieces that she used to match them together. None of them said January 29th. So this bag of plastic pieces found on the 29th, where'd that go? What happened to it? And if they found all these other pieces subsequent to that and putting together all those other pieces built a full taillight cover, well, then you've got extra pieces because you've got this bag of red taillight from the 29th that didn't end up as part of that assembly. So you've got extra pieces and, well, I guess you don't need those extra pieces. They can disappear. I'm being tongue in cheek here, but wow. He said the area where the clothing and that bag of red plastic were kept is in a secure area and that it's even equipped with an alarm. The thing is, it's not that anyone suspects some stranger from off the street is running into their intake area. There's no suggestion that someone wandered in off the road and messed with evidence. The problem here, and you can talk about how secure it is, that's great, but the person or one of the people who does have access is under suspicion. So you can say it's secure all you want. They might be better off to say it's not secure. Somebody else messed with it. Because if he's one of the few who had access to it, well, that narrows things down a bit. He says he's not an evidence officer and he never has been. He testified as to where the evidence goes, right? He says what happens is it goes into evidence and only 2 evidence officers have access to that, plus a supervisor who I believe is Tully. And he mentioned that the evidence officers process evidence if they see fit. Well, the reason that the envelope containing red plastic was not logged in with these evidence officers is because, according to Proctor, those evidence officers weren't there. There was nobody there. So the evidence officers are the ones who are supposed to process evidence if they see fit. Well, they weren't there to lay out clothes on butcher paper. So who laid out the clothes? He testified, or Lally brought out, that on February 1st, Proctor attended the Canton Police Department in the Sallyport, and they were going to process Reed's SUV pursuant to a search warrant. Proctor mentioned in his testimony that Later in the day, on February 1st, somebody from the accident reconstruction team also arrived at the Canton Police Department, it sounds like. Proctor testifies that crime scene services' role would be to come out and document the scene in more serious situations, such as homicide. They take video, they dust for fingerprints, they take photographs. And his answer, the way he's answering here, makes me wonder if he has a full understanding of what CSIs do. Or maybe it's me who's not understanding. Isn't crime scene services their version of CSI? Lally's going through the different times when crime scene services would be involved. And I go back to a question that I had earlier about crime scene services attending the hospital. In both Buchanan's testimony and Proctor's, they describe going to the hospital, noticing the clothing, talking about there's a missing shoe and contacting somebody else to say, hey, look for this shoe, how they noted Officer O'Keefe's injuries, all of this. And they describe going from the hospital to Dighton. And Buchanan had mentioned that he'd contacted crime scene services to come and document the clothing. But neither one of them mentions, and crime scene services arrived. They're not mentioning that. But we should have seen photos of the clothing in the pile where they lay, right? Which would indicate somebody took a photo, and then the question is going to be who. So if crime scene services arrives and takes photos of the clothing, then why do they not take the clothing with them? Take the clothing back to the lab, hang it up in a special drying cabinet or locker, and start processing that clothing, or at least take all the steps to preserve evidence, because some evidence degrades. Why would they take pictures and leave? I don't understand this. Why does crime scene services not take the clothing? It instead goes into Buchanan's personal vehicle and is driven all over the place in an uncontrolled environment, at least in terms of temperature. The clothes are wet, and that moisture will degrade certain types of evidence. So it's bizarre to me that crime scene services would not simply take the clothes with them, especially considering Proctor and Buchanan have to eventually take the clothing elsewhere anyway, because their office, that where they're describing laying it out on the butcher paper and everything in their intake area, and their evidence locker, that is a temporary storage. So it still would have to move elsewhere. Why are they doing that if crime scene services is there to take pictures? Are we going to hear from the crime scene services people specifically? Lally is asking the trooper about crime scene services coming out for searches at various times. And he doesn't say what times. He doesn't say that all of the searches included crime scene services. He rattles off a couple of dates, but not all of them. It's still unclear. And at this point, I really think that Lally is being intentionally unclear. I've come to believe that. And Lally asks, were the crime scene services people, was it the same person every time? And Proctor says, no, it wasn't. And you know what? I believe him. And the reason for asking this, I don't know if I need to tell you this, is Lally's trying to let the jury know that, look, there's no conspiracy here. Not all of those people are involved. Well, no, that's right. Not all of them, not everybody is involved. It doesn't take everybody. It takes a couple. It can be true that a whole lot of people are doing their jobs properly. But no matter what job you've got, whether it's in policing or a lab or data entry, you can only work with what you have, what you're given. You only have the information you have. Lally asks him, between the time you were in the Sallyport with the SUV on January 29th and the time that the people came to process the vehicle on February 1st, had you been in the Sallyport at any time? And Proctor said, no, well, whatever was done prior to him leaving. I have a question. It just occurred to me, and I could be way off base. You know, when Proctor went back to his office, and he calls it the evidence intake area, and he lays out the clothes, or somebody lays out the clothes on the butcher paper, and he can't put the bag of taillight into evidence storage. So it sits there beside the clothing. How many bags were there? And why does he need to say that? Is there video surveillance inside that evidence intake area? Did anybody see maybe a bag that possibly could have contained plastic pieces sitting around on a table there? There's a reason why he's saying the evidence bags were left like that. Nobody's going to go and examine each bag or anything. So if you had, say, one extra bag containing a whole bunch of pieces of broken taillight, who would know? Who would notice that? I think nobody. Okay, this video is way too long already. I will continue with Proctor's testimony in a separate video. I think this is going to take some parts. That's all I've got for you for the moment. I will keep working. Trust your gut. I'll see you in the comments.